Welcome, everyone. Good to see you. And we continue our study of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes. We are in the midst of chapter 3. Chapter 3 is the chapter that begins with the words, "There is a season for everything." And we spoke through all of those last time, but we're going to read through them again, but then continue and read the next part of the chapter, which continues to build on that idea, in my mind, at least in a very interesting way. So let's begin, and maybe just to go back for 1 minute to our conversation from 2 weeks ago. We've had Thanksgiving in the middle. We spoke about it in different ways, but one of the ways we spoke about there's a season for everything. We spoke was that everything is preordained, everything is in the stars. So what is our place within all of it then? What do we pick? Another way of looking at it was how do we each approach these different seasons in our lives and be proactive and meet them with wisdom and meet them with thoughtfulness. And the other was, well, if everything is already predestined, then what's the point of all of it? So we have all these different ways of understanding it. And a very powerful passage. Obviously, it's one that we read at funerals very often. So let's begin. Alan, I'm going to share my screen. If you mind reading for us the beginning again of chapter 3, and then we will continue on afterwards for about 10 verses, and see how far we get.
I'll read until you say stop.
Okay.
A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting and a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sowing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. What value then can the man of affairs get from what he earns? I have observed the business that God gave man to be concerned with. He brings everything to pass precisely at its time. He also puts eternity in their mind, but without man ever guessing from first to last all the things that God brings to pass. Thus I realized that the only worthwhile thing there is for them is to enjoy themselves and do what is good in their lifetime. Also, that whenever a man does eat and drink and get enjoyment out of all his wealth, it is a gift of God. I realize too that whatever God has brought to pass will recur evermore. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. And God has brought to pass that men revere him.
Do a little bit more.
What is occurring occurred long since, and what is to occur occurred long since, and God seeks the pursued.
Okay, I think we'll stop there for now. Maybe we'll go a little bit further today, if we get to it. Anybody have any thoughts on this first section and maybe how it relates to the next section, or any thoughts left over from last time about this whole meditation on the different times of life?
Incense going, okay? It's going. Incense. Okay.
God seeks the pursued.
Yeah, that's a very problematic verse. It's really,
Isn't just me.
yeah, no, it's really hard to know exactly what that means. We can talk about it
Which
for a
one?
minute. It's the verse 15. What is it? Everything up until 15 is very easy to make
Yeah.
it all
Oh,
rolls.
yeah.
What is occurring occurred long since, and what is to occur occurred long since, and God seeks the pursuit. I mean, midrashically, one of the ways that the tradition sees that, and I've actually seen Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel use this verse in one of his most beautiful speeches. But the way our tradition sees God seeks the pursuit, which doesn't make much sense in context really, but it means that God, anybody who's pursued, isn't anybody who's pursued by other people, God tries to help them and to come to their aid, right? So anybody who's pursued, anybody who's in trouble, God, as Abraham Joshua Heschel says, it doesn't matter if you're if the person who's being pursued himself is immoral or bad or whatever it is, God is always trying to help those who are pursued by other human beings. So that's one way of looking at it. What the scholars say, go ahead.
I was going to say, pursued maybe not so much by others as also, or perhaps by just all these worries and concerns. I mean, all this contemplation and all this heavy weight of, oh my gosh, what is all of this? Why are we here? What's the value? Isn't that in a sense feeling you're pursued with just all the thought and all the worry and concern, and it takes away from your actual doing what he's saying, enjoyment of the moments and the days, because you're just consumed, perhaps consumed by all of this. And so,
Don't think about it. Don't think about it. Just live it. Don't think too much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful.
But
Yeah.
that type of pursuit. And so God is, here, hey, look, there's this and there's this, do something with that. Stop worrying about it all.
Don't be pursued by all of it, because we're all going to go through all of it, right? We're all going to go through all those times, and don't try and engineer it. It's just going to be, and don't think about it too much. Beautiful. Well, we'll never know. One of the other ways, I really like that one of the other ways that scholars interpret it is that maybe pursued is the wrong translation. And maybe the scholars will say it could also mean what's vanished or what's illusionary. So God, as in God God, what is occurring occurred long since, what is to occur. So it kind of works into the whole idea of God is the only thing that's beyond all time, right? So there's everything that's vanishes, that's illusionary. God can see into that, and what is occurring is long since occurred. That's one way that the scholars see that. But let's go back 1 second. Disappeared. And near death can be translated also as disappeared or vanished. Right? God controls all things that exist, things that will exist, and things that no longer exist. Right? I think it's more interested to look at it as a way Deb did, or other midrashic ways. Okay. Any other thoughts on left over from last week? Or let's start looking at the link between these two sections. I think it's quite powerful, unless anybody else has anything else they wanted to say. Okay. So these three verses again. What value then can the man of affairs, I think it's an interesting translation, get from what he earns, from what he labors for? I have observed the business that God gave man to be concerned with. He brings everything to pass precisely at its time. He also puts eternity in their mind, but without man ever guessing from first to last, all the things that God brings to pass. Thus, I realize that the only worthwhile thing there is for them to enjoy themselves and do what is good in their lifetime. How does that link to what came before? he's kind of, Carol, go ahead. Look like you're about to say something. You're muted.
You're mute.
You're mute.
Well, earlier he seemed so cynical, like what, in fact, I remember reading this many years ago for the first time. I
Yeah.
was like, oh, I don't think I like this guy. But now he seems to calm down a little bit and say, I think what's really important is that we enjoy ourselves and we do what's good. And if that's my mission and why I'm here, I can do that. I can't control anything else, but I can enjoy myself and I can do some good out there. And
Yeah, beautiful. Exactly. And he's not saying that you should abandon all the planting, because if you don't plant, you ain't going to eat. So he's not saying, he's still saying you have to live by all those different seasons, by all those different times, right? But he's just saying that in the midst of all of it, because at least this is my take, we all go through all of those, right? It doesn't matter. Part of what he's saying, when there's nothing new under the sun, is we're all going to die. We're all going to grow old.
Yeah.
There's no, all the wealth in the world isn't going to change that. All the wisdom in the world is not going to change that. And we're all going to have all kinds of seasons. So with every season that comes, which we can never guess when it's going to come, right? We rarely know when the season is going to come, but we can do is to be present for the season when it's there, not be pursued by too many worries about it. And we can also try and do good amidst all of it, right? Do good in every season.
when this is just kind of a side story, but
Sure.
those other verses are some of my favorite. And when my former husband died, when Rachel's dad died, she wanted to design the headstone, and that's what she put on it. She was just 13,
Wow.
and she drew a tree and put to everything there's a season, and and the tree is very much a 13-year-old's tree. And it's
Beautiful.
it was very comforting to me at the time when she did it.
It's amazing. These verses have really that quality of comforting to people, of surrounding loss in particular, because they remind us of what about the different parts of life, and that this is all part of life, right? Every one of these is part of life, and rare is a person who doesn't see war in the world in their lifetime, right? And rare is a person who doesn't see peace, and rare is a person who doesn't love, and rare is a person who doesn't have hate. I mean, there's all of these coexist within all of our lives, and so there's a time for all of it. So what's his wisdom amidst all of it? If there's a time for everything, what's his wisdom? What should we do with it if this is life?
Something that I think of often when I'm reading these or hearing these lines is just that, you don't, like the light and dark, you can't appreciate or really fully, understand or grasp the concept of light unless you have darkness. And so maybe appreciating what is sown only, it really, you can't appreciate it as much as you can if you understand when there is nothing to sow. Love and hate. Do you really appreciate something, someone loving you until you really experience someone hating you? I don't know. I just, maybe that's not a good example, but just the opposites. It's war and peace. You can live in peace and it's just sort of ordinary and everything. You just don't really recognize it as peace until you know war. And then, oh my gosh, the value of peace shoots rockets up in value because war is so devastating and horrible. So
Hmm.
I don't know. I mean, I just feel like because it's all the, the yin yang of everything, I think that it creates a whole. And if you don't have one, you don't really have the other.
It's not until you have a pandemic that you appreciate the simple pleasure of going out to a restaurant or giving your friend a hug, or
Yeah.
Right.
all this, the little things that are part of life. Well, it goes back to what I think you were saying last week about, or 2 weeks ago, about the story of the Garden of Eden,
Yeah.
and the wisdom that we of, what is the point of leaving the garden, coming to this world of duality? Well, it teaches us a lot. You learn a lot from the duality of the world. It gives you a wisdom that you don't have if everything is always light, if everything is always perfect. The movement gives you a certain kind of wisdom, and maybe there's also, there's a wisdom to be learned by all of these times, right? And as you were talking, Carol, about your daughter, who is only 13, a very close family friend of ours passed away just about 10 days ago. And she had a daughter who was also 14, and who's right now kind of trying to struggle what to do with her mom's death, and coming to similar kind of things of, but it's, I think she mentioned that she feels that even though she knows that she's going through something difficult, she believes it'll make her a stronger person eventually. I think she said something like that. So it's, when we go through a loss, if we just try and push it away, then we don't learn what that loss can teach us about life, right? For every season, we have something to learn and to absorb. And maybe that's part of the lesson too.
And something, Carol, when you first started talking, you were saying, kind of talking about yourself, like, hey, I'm appreciating all of these things, and and it occurred to me that because you and I are in similar situations now, that it's also just like, this is like a big picture of a life. I mean, when you're young, you don't even think about the other side of anything. And then, you're in the middle and you're so overwhelmed with everything. And then you get to the other side of all that. And you can kind of look back and say, hey, there's, I'm just going to enjoy the rest of this ride. And you find the things because of your maturity and your experiences, and you've kind of gone through all the phases, and now you can see, yeah, what God really wants us to do is enjoy this ride that we're on and make the most of it, and not worry so much about, well, how big is that pile of earnings, or, what all are these great things that now maybe don't mean so much. Maybe it doesn't mean so much, because it's all about from here on out and enjoying the ride, and not so much looking at all the stuff on the sides.
Well, if it didn't, if one of your projects didn't come to fruition, you could say it wasn't its season to come to fruition, right?
Or what did I learn from it? I mean, there's value in everything, all the bad things that happen, I just always try to look at it as what's the gift in this, horrible package. I mean, there's got to be something. And when you try to, I don't know, try to enjoy that ride, find a way to understand it and enjoy it, I think it just is so much nicer. I mean, it's more fulfilling. It feels more like you're living rather than just, being a passenger. You're the driver instead of being a passenger. I don't know. I'm using these ridiculous examples, but
the phrase, he brings everything to pass precisely at its time. He also puts eternity in their mind. Now, what does that mean? That means that in our mind, in the mind of humans, we have a feeling of eternity. And the feeling of eternity is sort of the pre-duality, the pre-dialectical experience of living. so that both sides of these things are happening at the same time. In fact, you could say that if we can experience eternity or have a feeling like that, we experience something that the divine experiences, although I'm not sure that's really the case. But in any case, he says there, he puts eternity in their minds. So he puts eternity in our minds in a pre-dialectic way, before all of these opposites occur. In fact, from that position, we can see all these things as opposites. We don't, from a lower level, know which is going to take place before the other. We can't know that as human beings, but we can have the experience of eternity. And I think that that's what he's trying to get us to have, is the experience of eternity. And we can get the experience of eternity through meditation, through being aware of being aware of the now. There's lots of different ways of doing that, actually, from actually going up the middle of these dialectical opposites. If you play with those things in your head, you'll get the feeling of eternity. So if you're looking for the feeling of eternity, here's the pathway to it. Now, what does it give you? It won't put bread on the table for sure, but it'll give you a sense of what? A sense of maybe solace, a sense of comfort, a sense of something that's very hard to describe.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Well, it's a very interesting phrase, this one here, because so we have this little marker, because it's hard to understand. I also like to read it in that way, and in some ways, this, if we read it in that way, these few words become maybe the key to the whole chapter, if not more. There's a few of the commentators who do read it that way. In the Hebrew, it's gam et olam natan belibam, and also the world or eternity he put in their hearts. In the biblical, the heart was both a place of feeling but also of thinking. But olam can also mean what is hidden. So there's many different meanings that have been. So this is why they say he also puts eternity in their mind. But then you click and you see their little notes. He preoccupies man with the attempt to discover the times of future events, which is not how we would like to read it. But we don't know what exactly the original Hebrew is intended to bring to us. I think all of those are interesting. Phil, what are you about to say? Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I was curious about your reaction to this. In that verse 11 that you just quoted in Hebrew, and it says v'gam, and it's also there, because you have on the one, the translator in the new Anchor Bible, it's over 20 years old, I didn't know about it till a little while ago, he says this gam, he thinks, is adversative. It's and yet also. First he has be'ito, he sets everything in its time, but also he sticks eternity in our minds. I found that attractive. I wonder what you thought of that, or what others thought of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's adversative. He's contrasting it.
That's the duality of the first
Yeah.
part of the line.
Exactly. And there, if you look at the notes in the new JPS that you have before you, I don't know if you can see that on the screen, maybe not, but it says, i.e.,
he preoccupies
man with the attempt to discover the times of future events. Well, that's an interesting version of that, but it's almost like a playful reading of that. Anyway,
I don't like that note, but I like the way you put it, and I mean, and when you read that whole verse with that type of reading, or the way David was reading it, it's actually a very lovely verse, right? Because he brings everything to pass precisely at its time. We can't control when it's a time to mourn and when it's a time to rejoice. That's just what life brings us. But he also puts eternity into our hearts, into our minds. but without man ever guessing from first to last all the things that God brings to pass. So we have this ability to be present. We have this ability to be conscious. We have this ability to touch the eternal in every one of those moments. But it doesn't mean that we're going to be able to get out of all of these times or know when they're coming or be able to somehow anticipate them or guess. We just live within this world, and the key is to put our minds in the olam, in the eternal, which is very interesting. And it's, as I was saying, olam is also Rashi for one, but others look at it as being hidden. Eternity is what the word for eternity also comes from the word for hidden. So it's not always easy to find the eternal. You have to reveal it. You have to unveil it, so to speak. And so these verses are in some ways very interesting ones. These 3 verses. Then we have a next verse. Thus I realized, or I knew that the only worthwhile thing there is for them is to enjoy themselves. Here it's to lismoach, so to find simcha and do what is good in their lifetime. We have tov. How many times do we have tov? We have tov a lot in this whole section, but in this verse just twice. La'asot tov, to do good.
Tov, yeah.
So, right, to do good within each one of those periods, we know whether we're planting or uprooting, to try and find the good as best we can in all of it and do good. So I think may have been once talking to Rabbi Merelman, and we were talking about how there are 3 sermons: do good, be good, and I forget what the final one is, but they say that every rabbi only really has one sermon that they say again and again and again. I hope that's not true. All right. Well, so what is the only worthwhile thing to do? There's nothing that's good except to find simcha and to do good in their life.
Well, that's the level of action, the level of action and the level of our being human on a day-to-day basis, of course. But what he's pointing to is he's pointing to also the futility of that as far as finding a transcendental meaning to life. Okay, so that is, of course, is a given, that one should be a decent type and treat people decently and do good. That's a given. But is that going to give your life some transcendental meaning? Well, he said earlier, absolutely not. Okay, so he's pointing always towards the eternal. He's pointing always towards something that seems to be logically above the giving the level that we live at all the time. And the question is what are the methods of getting there? If you find something like that, you should say to yourself, wow, how do I get there? What sort of stuff do I need to do to be able to get there? And the rabbi has classes in meditation, and that's what you're looking for in those classes, I assume.
It is, I think that the meditation, the prayer can also do this. I mean, there's other different ways. Is about both doing this, which is finding a place to be present and enjoy yourself. And I think this verse is coming in the context of what came before, which is the different seasons of one's life. So within the seasons of one's life, and I think it's always nice to read all of it in the rest of the chapter in the context of its beginning, which is so powerful, then you're right. In this world, because there are going to be times in your world where you're going to be mourning, and there'll be times where you'll be sowing, and times where you're tearing. Within all of it, try your best to find simcha and do good and be present. But as we were saying, if there's a way to bring the infinite into every moment, and the practice of meditation, and I think also ultimately prayer. And in our tradition, prayer includes not only the 3 daily prayers, but also the 100 blessings you're supposed to say every day, blessings of gratitude and blessings of wonder. That those are all little opportunities for meditation throughout the day to connect you to that which transcends the seasons, right? And which gives you a connection to that place in your mind where the eternal is, where God is, right? We're made in the image of God. So what does it mean to be made in the image of God? It means that we have an ability to, each one of us as our human birthright, to experience that eternal in every moment, whenever we do. So there's doing good and being good, which is a goal, a given goal of life, and is part of the seasons and the challenge. It's not always easy when we're experiencing the different seasons to keep that, but at the same time, to when we're able to incorporate more and more of the infinite consciousness into our life, it brings even more to it. Even though we have this next part of the next verse also, that whenever a man does eat and drink and get enjoyment out of all of his wealth, it is a gift of God. What does he mean by that?
Something that just seems to be missing.
Go ahead.
And I understand why we would want to thank God, but there's no mention of the role of other people, because you can't do good or be good
The vacuum, yeah.
without involving other people. It's like, I don't know who said it, but the person who succeeds and only thinks they did it on their own by themselves without thinking of all the people that helped them, doesn't really appreciate what happened to them. It just seems like something is missing here, at least to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's why the some of the scholars have wondered if the author of Kohelet, did not have any children, or is estranged from his children, or displeased with his children. Just one side of that. Could also be that being a king on some level is a lonely role, or a lonely place to be in, or maybe this is just a very personal meditation. We all have to, we go through life, and we obviously have the people we walk through life with, but they don't come into life with us, and they don't leave life with us. And so the biggest questions of life are, and the biggest mysteries of life, maybe not the biggest question, but the biggest mysteries of life is about an individual search. We all face death alone on some level. I was struck by, I'm going to close my window 1 second. So my family friend who passed away, Allison, just a week ago, a week and a half ago, and when she was the last few days of her life, she knew that she was passing, and she asked she wanted certain people around her at that moment to be with her in her passing, and the people she chose were people who she thought would put her in the right frame of mind to face the unknown, and face what was about to happen to her, to prepare her spiritually. I mean, it's a very, very intense, very powerful thing. Her very last day, her children, her 2 daughters, wanted to come and be with her, and she was too weak, and she actually didn't want to see them in that moment, because she didn't think she was going to pass away that day, but she said she didn't want to see them because it was just too much. And she was in the space not of being a mom at that moment. It was so different, but she was in the space of I'm an individual about to pass over and I need to be prepared. And the whole experience of that, she was too tired at that moment. But then someone else said to her, no, you don't know, this might be the last, and you have to strengthen yourself to be with them. And so her daughters came in and she had a very powerful time with them, but she chose to spend her last few days with people who would help prepare her for the next stage. And so it was almost like she's still a mom, and she's an incredible mom who loves her children, but as she was passing away, she was also feeling who are the people who are going to help me? How can I, as an individual, prepare for this passage?
I appreciate the points you've just made. It's a very powerful way of making it. I think though that Alan's observation is important, not only in this verse here, these verses, but throughout the book. And it's been noted. I mean, that's one thing that makes this book so odd in the biblical canon. That it is focused, as it might be philosophically, on the individual's quest or seek for understanding, and without any of those social relations that are part of our moral order, as well as the actual concrete order, but also, and it comes in over and over again. I think that there's a certain loneliness there that it's acute. That's all.
No, you're very, very true. There are no fellows, there are no friends, no family, and no community. So it's not it's different than the Jewish lens that we're used to on some level. I mean it is biblical, so it's before community became the center of Jewish life. I mean, beforehand, the Jewish people still was obviously the center, right? We received the Torah together. We did everything together. We lived our purpose to God as a nation of priests, right? In the biblical image, and then in the rabbinic image, we lived in community. So our understanding of Jewish community and how we're always together and is more rabbinic in some ways. But it is odd. All of our stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs are of them and their relationships to each other, and of them seeking God with each other. Even Abraham, in his most powerful moment, is with Isaac, right? He's going to sacrifice Isaac, and he's having his conversation with Isaac, walking up the mountain to face God and his. So it is. Moses goes up by himself to God. And others do too, but there is also a lot of it is remarkable. You wonder if it is somebody who's chosen this viewpoint philosophically, or if it's someone who does a decent amount of funerals is you often find the older a person is, the less people are at a funeral, also because of their friends have passed away, and sometimes there's just not that many people left. And one can imagine that in this time, before modern medicine, it would have been even more so. How many of their people would have disappeared once you reached an elderly age?
Well, it's also possible that this eternity feeling is really other with a capital O. Okay, so that if one feels this feeling of eternity, one gets the sense of something infinite, something bigger than you, that's outside of you, that you're hanging around with at that particular time. So it replaces, in some sense, the interest in people to some degree.
Mhm.
And, you know, this feeling of eternity, what I'm saying is it's a feeling of otherness. It's the eternity is not you. It's not you. It's something other than you that's intruding upon your consciousness. So it's other than you. So you know,
Sure.
you can make that if you wish.
It's
And-
very full. Yeah, it's a very full other.
And well, Judaism is a way of life lived in community unless you have something of your own and
Mhm.
some space that's your own. You can't be that part of that community. That you have to pursue that as well.
You have to find you have to find your own meaning in your life, to really also get a lot out of the community. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even more than community, right? Lech lecha, right? That's one of the fundamental lines in the Torah, right? God tells Abraham, go to yourself, right? Leave your community, he says, right? Abraham, leave your community, leave everything you know, leave your nation, your father's house, the land of your birth, and go somewhere else. So there's also, maybe this is a lech lecha kind of book, you know, about seeking lecha, you know, yourself, seeking yourself.
That's actually what that means in that context, is go with yourself.
Go to yourself. Yeah.
No, that's very good. Mhm.
So there's,
I think it's interesting when I think about, you think about a baby being born, and basically the parents pick the baby's teachers. And then when the baby gets older and becomes an adult, you kind of pick your own teachers. And I think, you know, there's, I guess maybe what he's referring here, as David said, is that, you know, perhaps at the end you become your own teacher.
beautiful. It's well, there's a whole concept. This is in the East, I believe, that, you know, one begins one's religious life with lots of rituals, but the more you go on in your life, then you eventually abandon rituals and you have external teachers, and eventually you get to the internal teacher, which is the spark of God within every human being, and that's your internal teacher becomes your teacher. And I really like that in this context. And you know, there's a midrash, right, that before we come into the world, the angels show every soul, you know, this is where you're born, and this is where you're going to die, and this is who your parents are going to be, and we kind of, it implies we get to say yay or nay to all of it. And if not, maybe we get, you know, you have 3 different plans, A, B, C, Aleph, Bet, you know, Aleph, Bet, Gimel. But also what it does is it kind of brings to life that there is life before we meet our parents, and there is life afterwards. And, you know, in at least in Kabbalah, this is really, it's interesting. They have this concept of, do we have soul families? But the concept of soul family in Kabbalah isn't that when you pass away, you get to see your grandparents and your great grandparents and, you know, all of your kind of real family, but that we each have soul families, right? In Kabbalah, they believe in the Sefirot, right? There are different divine qualities, and they believe that each person's soul comes from a certain divine quality, right? One of these Sefirot, so, or a combination of them. So we each have a quality of our soul, and then when we pass away, we meet our soul family, or members of our, who are not our actual family here, our physical family, but our souls who know us, who share the same soul as us in some ways. They have the same quality as us. Our heart is their heart. Our mind is their mind, and they know us perfectly, and they're watching us throughout our earthly life. And is the way the Kabbalah sees it. So it's a sense of that our families here are in some ways everything we have, but that once we cross over, there's a soul family waiting for us who knows us even more better, who understands us perfectly, and they're our soul family, and they're there to be there. It's always found that to be a very powerful idea. But I think that we've brought up several times. I think it is powerful to keep bringing up that this quest or this these words that Kohelet is sharing with us is not coming from the place that we expect on some level, that it's something quite unique and something different. And the rabbis did debate whether to include this in the canon or not, because its tone is different than other biblical books, and because it says things which are not completely in line with the mainstream beliefs of the Bible in some ways, and why many believe that there were certain lines that were added to kind of put it back in line. Let's go forward a little bit in our last few minutes. So whenever a man does eat and drink and get enjoyment out of all of his wealth, it is a gift of God. One of the ways I see that is that there's sometimes when you eat and drink and do things that should give you enjoyment and they really don't, right? And there are other times where just a simple meal is just so enjoyable. And so it's saying it's a gift when you can actually be present and enjoy and get something out of the different seasons and all the rhythms. And everything is a gift. Some level, it's all a gift. So let's look at this. Verses 14. Now we're going to a slightly different direction. Could somebody read for us verses 14, 15, 14 and 15 for now. Deb, how about you?
Okay. I realized too that whatever God has brought to pass will recur evermore. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. And God has brought to pass that men revere him. What is occurring occurred long since, and what is to occur occurred long since, and God seeks the pursued.
It really is a strange verse, a strange end to that verse there, that last clause of 15. So how do we see this in the context of the seasons? And there's a season for everything.
Well, he's talking about God's perspective of the world being an eternity, so that God supposedly sees everything from beginning to end simultaneously. So everything that has happened has already happened for him, because God doesn't experience the passage of time. Now, this particular view seems to rule out any form of miracles. So lots of people have been interested in that, except some people say, well, the miracles are also put in there in the beginning.
Yeah.
They're put in there from the beginning. But this sort of hamstrings any divinity that you want to be involved with, who can't actually change the plan as he goes along. Why do we need a divinity that can't change the plan? Why can't we have an active divinity that doesn't need to, an active divinity where not everything was put in eternally, but you might be able to bug them a little bit and get them to change the plan for you. I think that's a much more comforting view. And the reason people don't like that is God's not supposed to be able to move. God's supposed to be able to be motionless and not sort of touch his creation after he created it. But these are all beliefs that you can either decide you're going to believe or not believe.
Well, it's interesting. It is that's one of the great questions of the medieval philosophers. And I agree with you. There's not much God. I personally agree with you. There's not much God left for me when there's nothing that can be added to God working in the world. And there are other people for whom saying God can't work in the world is the only God they can accept. If not, why is there evil in the world? And that's a whole long philosophical debate. I agree with that. But it's interesting because I actually read the verse a little bit differently, which was that all the things that are supposed to pass are going to pass, and the world is just the way it always is, and everything's already happened, right? And the way at least I was reading in the context of what came before as well is that every one of us has to go through all of the seasons, and right, we all grow old, we all die, and we all experience all those seasons. And even though they look different now, they look different for us now in 2021 than they did in 400 BC or 300 BC or whenever, or 1000 BC or 900 BC, whenever this book was truly composed and authored. On the other hand, they're not that different, right? I mean, that's why Carol's daughter, why Rachel found meaning in these verses, even in her life as a 13 or 13-year-old, and because they still apply to us. These seasons still apply to us, even though our lives are so different, and Facebook can't change that, and the internet can't change that, and even if we have self-driving flying cars, we're still going to grow old and die, right? So it's still these verses still apply to us, and so even though the details look different, and on one hand humanity is advancing and discovering things we could have never imagined, on the other hand all these seasons still come to pass. We still build, we still destroy, we still have war, we still have peace. There's on one hand there's nothing that's different.
Well, so the other verses made me feel like there's something there. There is that kind of road in between the duality. Yeah, there's something to experience and something that makes it kind of worthwhile. This, I feel, goes in a different direction. That whole sense of everything preordained, so what's the point?
Well, there was a Hasidic tale that I read. I don't remember the particulars, but it was, the angel of death was looking for somebody who was supposed to die, but somehow he made a mistake. Either he got the name wrong or something like that. So he picked somebody else. And I know that, for example, when my father was sick when he was a young man, they changed his name. His name was Jacob, and they gave him the name Jonah, so that he would heal and not be taken. So how does that fit into this?
Well, I think that's what David was saying, is there's a time for everything, but there's also it's a little bit more interesting than that, thank God, right?
Yeah.
It's got a little.
There are exceptions.
Yeah.
There are exceptions.
Yeah.
When I was a young man, I used to have a dream, so to speak, and I had an AntiKarma. Okay, and she was doing a tapestry in some sort of a room that had a violet color. And I'd go in there and I'd say, AntiKarma, can you change this just a little bit so that it's going to come out a little bit differently? Because I think the way this is going to come out is not going to suit me. She said, David, is that you again asking for another favor? I say, yeah, for sure. Anyway, and somehow she changed that. Now the name, the interesting thing is her name was not Karma, but AntiKarma. Okay, so you have to think about that from an Eastern perspective.
Well, the what's the point of prayer, right? If karma and if the world is predestined and everything is, but I think we have the ability. I mean, this is why this is the 13 attributes of compassion in our tradition. Maybe this is a good place to end because they're associated with with Hanukkah, in the mystical tradition at least. But the 13 attributes of compassion, we believe that by evoking God's compassion, then God will shift the karma of the world, right? The God will shift the predestiny of all the times that, and that's, obviously it doesn't work for people who don't believe that God can shift the physical world. But that is a big part of, especially the 13 attributes of compassion. And so there's a beautiful mystical belief that on Hanukkah, when through the lighting of the candles, one evokes this is how it comes to it, is that there's two psalms associated with Hanukkah in our tradition. There's the one which is the psalm for the dedication of the house, and the other one is the verse that finishes the psalm that finishes with the words Hine ma tovu ma na'im, right? How good and how pleasant it is for brothers and sisters to dwell together in unity. It is as the oil flowing down Aaron's beard, right? You remember that from that psalm? So the oil, of course, suddenly makes it a Hanukkah psalm. So the mystics take it and they believe that, so to speak, in the beard of God. They don't believe that God has a beard, but in that cosmic place that they consider to be the beard of God, which is a very, very high place. And they believe that compassion comes from the beard. So there's this belief that on Hanukkah, our candles and our hearts going up evoke the beard of the divinity, and that the compassion starts to come down the beard down through all the worlds into ours. And that the beard is the 13 attributes of compassion. That's where there's literally these armies of angelic compassion in the beard, and they get evoked and they start sending compassion down the beard through all the worlds, from the highest worlds down to our world. Because the way the Kabbalah sees it, I think this is actually very interesting, is that the duality persists even after our world. Even worlds above our own still have duality, have good and evil. But eventually you get to a world that only has compassion. And that's the only world that can undo karma, because it's above the karma, it's above the judgment. And so when you can reach that high to that place beyond it, when you can reach the compassion, then that compassion flows into the world, and that can literally change the destiny, can change the seasons. And it's not where he's maybe going. He seems to be, in my mind at least, going to a place of conscious living, right? Conscious being. We have all of these, we can't change them, but we can do is change where we are in ourselves as we go through it. We can change, we can just be. And this has been on my mind with having to cancel my plans to go to Israel. You can plan, but sometimes it was not the time to go to Israel. And so it was a time to stay here. So, and that's part of what this whole pandemic has taught us, is just being, right? This is very much relates to everything we've been talking about today, which is you can plan everything you want, but the universe has other plans for you, and you're just not going to be able to do all the things you want. But there's a great peacefulness and joy, a great simcha that comes from just letting go and just going with the season that comes and doing everything you can with the season that comes. So if it's not the season you wanted, then it wasn't its time. And so I hope that on this Hanukkah, we all find the ability to just let go and to be in joy and in peace, and simcha and in shalom and shalva and serenity with the et that's given to us.
Amen.
Amen.
That's beautiful.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Very nice.
Nice to see everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Thank you very much. Very good.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
and happy Hanukkah.
Happy
Yeah.
Hanukkah.
Yeah, thank you. Happy Hanukkah, everyone.
See you Saturday night.
Bye.
Bye.